Hello, this is Dwight Mutonono, also known as Nyarazi, also known as Mutos, and welcome to the Connection Desk. In the last session, we were in Philippi, and we live at Lydia's house, where Paul and Silas had to be asked to leave the city or the town of Philippi. And today we move on, and they move on from Philippi through to Thessalonica, which is what we're going to be looking at, how they entered Thessalonica. Again, they are now in the region of Macedonia, and Philippi is in Macedonia. Thessalonica is also part of Macedonia. And in the next session as well, we'll be talking about Berea, which is also again in Macedonia. But today, we are talking about Thessalonica and what happened when Paul and Silas entered this space called Thessalonica. So Acts chapter 17 from verses 1 through to 9 is where we are today. When they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As his custom was, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that the Christ had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I am preaching to you is the Christ, he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and not a few prominent women. But the Jews were jealous, so they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some other brothers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying there is another king, one called Jesus." When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. Then they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go. Okay. So, after this release from the Philippian jail and the appeal from the officials for them to leave the city, they then go on and they went to this place called Thessalonica. They traveled to on a road called the Egnatian Way. The Egnatian Way, some of it is actually still visible to this day, but that's the road that they traveled on from Philippi through to Thessalonica. The road passed through a few cities which are mentioned in this passage. It passed through a few towns. It's Amphipolis, which is about 33 miles or 50 kilometers from Philippi, and then they passed another place called Apollonia, a further 27 miles or more or less 40 kilometers. And then after that, they finally did another 35 miles, about 50 kilometers to Thessalonica. So all in all, it was a trip of about 100 miles or 140 kilometers from Philippi to Thessalonica. And they went along the Egnatian Way to go there. So why Thessalonica? Why choose to go to this space called Thessalonica? It seems that there was no Jewish synagogue in Amphipolis and Apollonia. So Thessalonica was the capital of this province of Macedonia. Remember we mentioned that they were now in Macedonia. Thessalonica was the capital of that area. And the population of the city, it's not clear what actually the population was, but some accounts talk about 40,000, other accounts about 200,000. And the most populous and wealthy Greek city it was one of the most populous and wealthy Greek cities. It was only next to Corinth in terms of the population and wealth. So we are dealing with a big city. So why Thessalonica, the capital of Macedonia? It's a big city, one of the most populous and one of the most wealthy in that area. And another reason might be that Lydia was a businesswoman. And being a businesswoman, she had connections in Thessalonica, and she suggested maybe that Paul and Silas think about going to Thessalonica from there. So this was a strategic decision. Paul and Silas made a decision to preach there, and it was probably for those strategic reasons. Where would it be most effective to go, and where would we have the best reach if we want to have the best reach in the area? So they end up in Thessalonica because of that reason, because of those reasons, likely because of those reasons. And notice that the ministry or team leaders are Paul and Silas. That's the other thing that we want to take note of. An apostle and a prophet. So we've got an apostle and a prophet together, and they are going together to start this work in the different spots, in the different parts that they are going. They are mentioned together in this section, just as Paul and Barnabas were mentioned together. Now we have Paul and Silas being mentioned together. When we have biblical leadership, is most ideally done through a team. It's the most ideal form of biblical leadership. Timothy is not mentioned by name, but he seems to have been he was part of the team. And he might have followed from Philippi sometime later. He does get mentioned when they are in Berea, but he doesn't get mentioned right here. But when they do, in the next session, we'll meet Timothy again. So they go to the synagogue. A synagogue would be an excellent point of contact for the gospel. And this is why Paul's strategy was to look for a synagogue first when he entered a city. And we see that they spoke for 3 Sabbaths in a row. He reasoned from the scriptures. It says for 3 Sabbaths in a row, he reasoned from the scriptures. He explained the Old Testament prophecies, proved that Jesus is the Messiah, explained that the Messiah must suffer and rise from the dead. So we see the content of his message and what he was saying to these people who were in this area of Thessalonica. Then the new believers that we see or that we get introduced to, some Jews believed along with many Greeks and prominent women. That's how it's described. And the gospel was preached to the Jew first and then the Gentile, to men and women, some of whom were prominent or wealthy individuals. And it's interesting that there's particular mention of the women who were prominent. And up to now, we've actually got about 2 women that are very significant and that we see playing significant roles here. There's Mary and Lydia in the narratives that, the earlier narratives, we saw Mary quite prominently in Jerusalem. Now we see Lydia being a prominent person who's helping Paul as they are into Paul and Silas as they're in this area of Philippi. While there's a mention of 3 Sabbaths, and some have actually said, well, Paul only stayed there for 3 weeks. I'd like to say that, as I've looked closely and as others have looked more closely, it seems that they stayed more than 3 weeks. It seems they started with a Jewish focus and spoke to the Jewish community for about 3 consecutive Sabbaths. But then they continued in Thessalonica for some weeks or maybe even months after that. So Philippians it says the Philippians sent money at least twice while he was in Thessalonica. I'll be reading those scriptures, Philippians 4 verse 15 to 16. In addition, it says Paul supported himself by manual labor, it might be that some considerable time passed before the aid came. So if he supported himself by manual labor, as we will read shortly, it was probably because he was there for more than 3 weeks. And a significant number of Thessalonian converts were formerly idolatrous Gentiles. We'll be reading that again in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 9. So let me just read the portions of scripture that I've talked about. So Philippians 4, from verse 15 through to 16, it says there, moreover, as you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, except you only. For even when I was in Thessalonica, you sent me aid again and again when I was in need. So there's something there. He was in Thessalonica and they sent him aid again and again. So remember, we're talking about a distance of about 100 miles or 140 kilometers, and somebody would likely have been going either by foot or, if they had more money, the person would then use something like some sort of animal drawn transport. But we are looking at them sending aid again and again. So it is probably more than 3 weeks that is there. Another argument that says it's more than 3 weeks, surely, this is 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9. Surely you remember, brothers, our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preached the gospel of God to you. We worked night and day in order not to be a burden. Again, that seems to be a longer period. And then 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 7 to 10, it says there, for you yourselves know how you ought to follow our example. We were not idle when we were with you, nor did we eat anyone's food without paying for it. On the contrary, we worked night and day, laboring and toiling, so that we would not be a burden to any of you. We did this not because we do not have the right to such help, but in order to make ourselves a model for you to follow. For even when we were with you, we gave you this rule: if a man will not work, he shall not eat. And then the final one that we're looking at, the Lord's message rang out from you, not only in Macedonia and Achaia. Your faith in God has become known everywhere. Therefore, we do not need to say anything about it, for they themselves report what kind of reception you gave us. They tell how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God. That's 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 9. And notice the mention of Achaia. It's a region that we'll be talking about a little bit later when he goes to Athens. But the message rang out from you not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but it rang out to all these spaces. So, the Jewish rejection. After some time, the Jews became jealous. Paul and Silas' ministry was growing, and again, we see this pattern. The issue was not so much about the accuracy of the message that they were preaching. It was more about the feelings of envy or jealousy. And they rounded up bad characters. That's what this portion of scripture says. They rounded up bad characters. And they started a riot in the city. So their strategy was to get people frenzied into a mob psychology. And after they frenzied the people into a mob psychology, they went for Paul and Silas at Jason's home. They knew that they were at Jason's home at some point, obviously. So they went to Jason's home, hoping that they would find Paul and Silas there, but they were not there. And they wanted them to be beaten by the crowd. But, by providence, somehow Paul and Silas were not at that house at that time. The demonic approach a demonic approach and a demonic strategy is to stir up and frenzy crowds so that people begin to do things without really thinking. They are emotional, they've been hyped up, and then they begin to do all kinds of activities in that state. And that's what that's what the Jewish unbelievers tried to do. And they tried to get this crowd to kill Paul and Silas. And I'm sure we've seen this kind of thing, this kind of strategy, where you get a mob, you get a group of people to rally around a cause. And oftentimes the people, if you really ask the mob, what are they rallying about and what are they in a frenzy about? Why are they rioting? You get different answers from different people. They often don't really know even why they're doing what they're doing. They don't even really know what their cause is. And these guys actually looked for bad characters, and who could stir up and bring all kinds of commotion in the city. So they created this commotion and tried to get Paul and Silas beaten up. But of course they couldn't find them. And then Jason and some other brethren were taken before the city officials, the assembly, the citizen body, which had judicial authority in the city. And they were accused of harboring Paul and Silas, people who had caused trouble all over the world. This was an exaggeration and distortion, of course, but they've, because they haven't gone all over the world, even their known world at that time, but they've caused trouble all over the world. And then they've defied Caesar, saying there's another king. Of course, Jesus being this other king. So it was a charge of treason. This is a serious charge, which would have, resulted in a death sentence. So this was the charge against Paul and Silas. And Jason and their host were being held responsible for what they had brought into the city, because Paul and Silas were there with their guests. And it seems the city officials did not buy the story, because Jason is given a very light punishment compared to the charges against them. Right, so what were they, how did this story end? They had to put in some money as security. Jason was made to pay a bond, a guarantee that there would be no disturbances in Thessalonica due to the presence of Paul and Silas. That's really was probably what that was, that bond that he was made to pay. And it meant that they had to leave Thessalonica, and they immediately did that night. They were sent away by night. And this might have been what Paul refers to in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 18, as Satan preventing him from going back to Thessalonica. Satan is a liar and distorter who fights against God's promise, God's purposes. And Paul talks in that portion of scripture of 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 18, and he says, "For we wanted to come to you. Certainly I, Paul, did, again and again, but Satan opposed us." We'll talk a little bit more about this whole area of Satan opposing them as they wanted to go back to Thessalonica. We'll talk a bit more about that in the next session, but for now we will stop at this point where they're in Thessalonica. This was their experience in this city, this major city, and their time is cut short. But again, they're a group of believers that have been left, and there's a church that has started, and we can even name one of the people there and the group around him. There's this man called Jason, and there's a group around him. So in Philippi, there's Lydia, the Philippian jailer, and then here we find Jason as a key person who is actually named, and they leave from Jason's house and they move on to the next place, which is Berea, and we're going to talk about the experience in Berea in the next session. You are blessed.